welcome to the Polgar Chess University. For this lesson, I chose some interesting attacking games of Bobby Fischer. Well, the legendary American world champion, of course, was an absolutely brilliant player, and I really liked his style because he had a very solid foundation before he started an attack. Kind of the way I like to do it. Of course, I didn't get as good at it as he did, but still trying to learn. I hope you do too. Well, let's enjoy together some of the brilliant attacking positions of Bobby Fischer. Here we are. Okay, this is a game that he played in 1967, and at the moment we have a equal material, and our rook is already on the 7th rank, which is generally a very good thing. It's something we aim for. However, that very rook on e7 is under attack, and if it would need to retreat, black would be ready to capture our pawn on d4 with a discovery attack. Black would win a pawn, at least temporarily, and certainly wouldn't have much worries. However, when we have a rook on the 7th rank, that usually calls for a follow-up to that. We can see that our queen on c2 is kind of with one eye, is looking already towards the black king, towards the h7 square. So we do have pressure at the moment on the h7 square, a little bit, not enough at the moment, as well as on the g7 square or pawn. Okay, so the question is, how can we bring more force to the attack to make it work? Well, there is only one piece we have on the king's side, and that is our knight. So the first thing we need to look at, is there a way to get our knight involved right away without wasting any further time? And yes, indeed there is. And that's exactly what Bobby Fischer did. He moved his knight to g5, ignoring the threat on the rook, because of course if now the queen would capture the rook, queen would capture pawn on h7, voila, checkmate. Now, the beautiful thing is that white created a second threat as well. And for example, if black right now would play the natural knight f6 move, defending the h7 square pawn, then white would be ready for a sacrifice and play rook g7. Check. The point being, if king takes, fork arrives on e6. Okay, let's go back. Knight g5. What else may black try? Pushing the h-pawn doesn't help, because queen still would arrive to h7 to checkmate. So let's look at g6. Well, that's relatively the best defense right now. At least it's a bit tricky, because if now rook captures on h7, the knight would be hanging on g5. Although that's playable as well for white, because after rook h7 and queen takes, black's knight is also hanging, but then also black can capture our pawn, and at the moment we still have material equality without any clear way for white to win. So going back again and looking at the position after knight g5, g6, what should we do? Well, things improved a bit, because now both the rook and the knight are aiming at the h7 pawn. So what white needs to do at the moment, make a simple defensive move. Actually, it's not just defensive, it has a multi-purpose ideas here. After queen e2, we didn't only protect the rook, which is one important thing, because now we're clearly just threatening to capture on h7, but white created a second, even more dangerous threat, and that is to move the queen to e6, which will check black's king, and of course also fork the knight on d7. So that's a very serious threat that black cannot afford to allow. Black needs to move one of his rooks to the 6th rank to literally guard the e6 square. But when that happens, white will be ready to capture the pawn, and now white won a pawn while the attack still continues. Of course, the game could have been continued, and I would know plenty of people who wouldn't have resigned, even at grandmaster level, as Bobby Fischer's opponent did. But it's certainly undeniable that even after black's defense, which we are seeing right now, and now white playing queen g4, white's advantage is obvious with an extra pawn, and the black king still being in a very sensitive position under the fire of white's queen and knight, and of course the rook from the corner on a1 anytime can get into the attack as well, and should be getting to e1. Well, a very nice attacking end by Bobby. Okay, let's move on to our next example. Here we go. Okay, in this position it was again Bobby's turn, and things are already going very well. Even though it seems that both sides are attacking, which they are, it is obvious that because it's white's turn, it is white who will arrive first. And now it's very important to make forceful moves, and the first such move is to move the rook down to d8 with a check. Now black has two options: to trade or not to trade. If black does not trade, the game ends immediately by rook d7. Okay, so let's see what happens if black does trade. That's what black exactly did. Take, take, and king e7. And at first you may think that now the rook needs to move, and then black will have his own turn. For example, after rook h8, black would play, let's say, rook d5, and black would have also a pretty strong attack. However, unfortunately for black, white has a much better move. And that move is moving the queen to g8. Of course, this move doesn't just simply protect the rook on d8, but also at the same time creates several checkmate threats with the queen on e8 or f8, of course. Now the only way for black to defend against both of those checkmate threats is to advance the pawn to f5 and open a little escape square on f6. So now after either of those checks on e8 or f8, the black king would go to f6 and hang on for the moment. However, white can do better. White played rook e8, and this is when black resigned. Well, black doesn't have much hope really. If the king would go to f6 trying to hang on to the pawn on f7, that would end the game right away with queen g5, of course. Game over. On the other hand, if the black king would run the other way to d6, which is relatively the best choice, then white could either check on f8 or actually could simply capture the pawn also on f7. And it's quite obvious that with the upcoming checks on d8 or e7, black's position is quite hopeless. Let's move on to our next example. And in this one it was Bobby Fischer who was black, not white, for a change. And it was his turn. And now we're in an endgame, so normally you wouldn't think of attacking when you're in an endgame. However, I can't stress it enough how important it is to always keep in mind the attack or the safety of the king, even when there are no longer queens on the board, or even when there are no longer a lot of pieces to coordinate an attack with. In fact, as you can see, in this case we only see for black a rook and a knight in addition to the king and pawns. But this is one of those rare examples when even so, black can create a successful attack against the white king. Ironically, it is quite interesting that if it would be white's turn, white also would have a winning attack against black's king. It's kind of interesting that if it was white's turn, white would have the opportunity to move the bishop back to c5, and with that attack the rook on g1 and open up the d file and threaten with checkmating black's king with rook d8. So that's kind of interesting that it's not only that black needs to worry about how to find a winning move here, but actually had to be careful not to lose also. So, any ideas what black should do? Well, the good news, we already see that the white king has no move. So, all black would need to do, not to change anything on the pieces that are taking away the possible squares from white's king, and bring in a new piece that would actually give the checkmate. And in this case, that little piece is the pawn from g7 to g5. So what happens now is black is threatening to push the pawn up to g4, which would be checkmate. And because of the unfortunate positioning of the white rook where it is on d3, it cannot cover or protect that square g4 from any square which wouldn't result in losing the rook. So in this position, if rook g3, the knight would capture the rook, and then already black would have a significant material advantage and an easy win. White tried instead to play bishop g3 to not directly protect the g4 square another time, but trying to disconnect the black rook from g1 from the g4 square. Well, nice thought. The problem is that black had a backup plan by playing h5. And now the same checkmate threat is right there, and now things are even worse because white needs to lose a whole rook in order to stop it, compared to the previous move when after rook g3 white would have lost only an exchange. And this is where white resigned. Let's move on to the next example, which is a rather famous game from the Soviet Union versus the rest of the world match in 1970, played white by Bobby Fischer and black by the former world champion Tigran Petrosyan. What do we see in the current position? We see that black is a pawn up. We also see quite clearly that the black king is in a very miserable position in the middle of the board. It's stuck in the middle. It would like to go to c8 and b8 and hide, but that takes time, and therefore it is white's task to prevent just that. As long as there are the queens and the rooks on the board, of course, the king in such a position usually is in major danger. But it would take only one more move for the black king to get to c8 and things would be under control. That is why time is the essence. I suggest you take a few minutes if you haven't yet found a move and try to do it. Okay, let's see how the game continued. White now played bishop to f5, a quiet, simple move that simply prevents the white king from running away. Now, one of black's problems is that if at the moment the knight would try to move to d7 to again threaten to run to c8, and by the way attack the queen at the same time, white now is ready to checkmate in two moves with queen e7, and because now the knight all of a sudden is in a pin, simply queen f8 checkmate. Okay, so this didn't work out for black. Let's go back because that's not how the game continued. Let's see another move which also wasn't played in the game but looks natural, rook e8. Now again white would continue with a forceful move, queen d4 check. Only move to avoid losing material immediately is knight d7, but now white would trade rooks, force the king out again to the fire, then simply capture the pawn on g7, and it's quite obvious that the checks are coming from all directions, whether it's gonna be rook e1 or bishop g6, the black king is dying. And now let's go back and look at how Petrosyan continued after bishop f5. He played bishop f8 to f7, Unfortunately for him, this doesn't help really either. Bobby continued with rook d1 check. Now again, the knight is the only piece that can block, which would avoid losing material, although the problem is that doesn't help either. This is not what Petrosyan played, but if he would have, white would play rook f2 e1, threatening checkmating immediately on e8. The only way really to guard it is with rook, although black could play rook c8 also, trying to clear the c7 square for the king, but then after queen e8, white simply wins the rook. So after rook f8, white would continue rook fe1, and now rook f8. White would continue similarly as the idea we already saw earlier, queen e7, knight is pinned now, and checkmate. And let's get back to the game one more time. After rook d1 check, the game continued with the rook blocking. Well, this avoids the immediate checkmate, but of course is losing an exchange right away. White captured the rook. If the rook captures back, white is ready to checkmate immediately with rook to f8. Game over. The game continued with rook capturing on d7, but now the follow-up is queen b8. If now the queen blocks, white would continue with trading rooks. Of course, if king takes rook d1, wins immediately. Knight takes, and the quiet queen d6 with pretty much an deadly threat of rook f8. Let's go back again, because that's not what Petrosyan played. In this position, he rather moved the king out to e7, which wasn't really solving the situations either, because another check came, and here he resigned, because after king f7, checkmate arrives with queen e8. A brilliant play by Bobby Fischer. Let's see the next example, which is also played by him against Hook in the 1970 Chess Olympiad in Siegen. What we see in this position again is the insecurity of black's king, the black king being in the middle of the board. White has an extra pawn, but it's a doubled one on the c-file. That's not what black's problem is. The black's problem is the fact that the king is where it is, and it can get under immediate fire. If black would get to trade some pieces, for example, trade the rooks maybe with rook d7, or get to trade queens, things wouldn't be as bad. But black never gets the time to do that, because white right now has a forced way to win. One thing that's important to realize is, and it's important to be imaginative and creative when you play chess. So right now, the first thing I'd like to imagine is the white rook not being on f6. So if you can imagine that rook being off the board, it is glaring that the white queen could get to f6 with a very powerful check, and then when the king would get out of that check to f8, white could capture the rook in the corner with a check, king comes back to e7, the queen goes back to f6 again, and when the king goes to f8, the bishop will capture the pawn on h6. I hope you can picture all of this. What I'm talking about is the white queen being able to, for example, capture his own rook, which obviously he cannot. And then force the black king to f8, then capture the rook in the corner, and so on, as I mentioned. But let's get back to reality from dreaming. We know that we wish we wouldn't have that rook on f6. How can we get rid of it? Well, there is a way to do it with rook e6 right away. It's not a bad choice, but not the best one. Right now, if the king captures, the good news is we're ready to checkmate right away. On the other hand, black can also capture with a knight when we achieve our goal in getting the queen to f6, and then capturing the rook, and then coming back with the queen, obviously with an excellent position, with winning later in the game. It's a bit better, even more precise I would say, though, to do what Bobby Fischer did. He captured the knight first with a check, so the knight can no longer capture back on e6. His opponent captured back with the pawn, and now the rook captured on e6. Now the difference is there is no knight to capture back, and if either the pawn or the king captures, the same queen f6 results in checkmate. Of course, after the king runs away, white could now just capture the queen, and that's certainly a good idea, and an easy win followed up by queen f6. But as our silicon friends prove us, they are the most precise, more precise than our humans, and it has shown that queen f6 is the most precise move, because now black cannot avoid the checkmate within 2 more moves. White is of course threatening not only the queen but the rook now, also on h8 with a checkmate, and after queen e6, queen takes rook. I just wanted to share this elegant checkmate with you, and game over. And now finally, let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. Wow, what a position! Black is up a bishop and a knight and a pawn, which generally is a more than sufficient material advantage, especially when we talk about endgames. The only one thing that's going for white is the d7 passed pawn that's about to get promoted. Well, I suggest you take some minutes and try to figure out how can white still save himself in this hopeless looking position. Okay, hopefully you found it. And first of all, what we need to understand is, why is it hopeless looking? Our pawn is about to get promoted. That's very true. But when our pawn gets promoted, for example, to a queen, the black knight could make a discovered check by moving to e6. Now the white king is in check, and the white queen is also attacked. So king moves out, knight takes queen, and black is up a bishop and a knight. So how can we save this situation? Was promoting the pawn to a queen a good choice? Maybe we should promote it to a different piece? Well, I have news. Promoting the pawn to a queen was an excellent choice, because if now black doesn't go and try to win the queen, white will have actually the upper hand, having material advantage. And if now we go to the correct square, which is a6, then after the knight captures the queen, amazingly we have resulted in a stalemate. How beautiful is that? So always have hope, even when you're in a difficult position. You never know, you may play for a stalemate and get an escape. Well, I hope you enjoyed the nice attacking games of Bobby Fischer, and of course our jewel of the week. Thank you so much for listening, and so long until next week. Bye-bye.